coat on. Boy, it's sometimes it's an act of Congress. I was trying to fix a problem with my heat and get it on for the year. Friday and Saturday, and I'm still banged up from it. Oh, man. So anyway, but we have it on, so the kitty is warm, even when I wasn't home last night. At least the kitty cat can enjoy it. Okay, well, the empiricists. We call them the British empiricists. They're all from the British Isles. The British Isles are England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So they're from 3 of the British Isles. John Locke from England, George Berkeley from Scotland, and George Berkeley from Ireland, David Hume from Scotland. And together then we call this famous trio of philosophers the British empiricists. Now, the computer seems to have a mind of its own this morning. Well, empiricism is a point of view that contrasts with rationalism, right? Rationalism claims that what counts as knowledge is absolutely certain knowledge, and the only way we gain that is through our reasoning faculties. Empiricists say, well, no, if anything counts as knowledge, it comes through the senses, and it comes to us through the senses after we're born. Empiricists from John Locke onwards rejected the claim of the rationalists that we have innate knowledge, innate ideas. So now I'll remind you that these page numbers are really from different books. Yeah, uh-huh. Well, that's a very good question. Not necessarily first-person experience. In other words, you can get knowledge from a textbook, but maybe the person who first found that out, used their senses to do the observations. Yes, yeah, empiricists can definitely go along with that. But the idea is the first knowledge came via your senses, or your senses aided by, tools like microscopes, telescopes. And actually, the next slide kind of emphasizes that. So an empiricist maintains that we can know something if we can justify it with respect to what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste, right? If we can justify it by our senses. So knowledge comes by our senses after we're born. And some empiricists make this distinction. We're not going to lay on it heavily, but between basic empirical beliefs, and this really goes to the question you were just asking. These are beliefs that we have from what we directly experience, right? You say, well, there's a set of keys on the table, right? Or people are standing outside the door when I came here. Why? Because their senses tell them that the door is locked, right? You know, the red light is flashing, and probably some people tried the door. You know, so that would be direct knowledge. But if, you know, if I called up the person over there at security and said, hey, I need you to unlock 320, it's locked, well, they don't have direct experience of it, but they're taking a claim from me that it's locked, which ultimately is based on first-person experience. So, so there's what we directly experience. In other words, seeing a red telephone produces a belief in me that there's a telephone there, and so my observations, my seeing it, touching it, etc., justifies my belief that there's a telephone on the desk in front of me. But then we can have beliefs that we infer from what we're told, or that we infer from evidence that we think points in the direction of a piece of knowledge. In other words, we weren't on the earth, no human being, as far as we know. Let's set aside that group of fossils that has human tracks following brontosaurus tracks as an anomaly. I don't know if any of you ever have heard about that. I mean, there is a fossil preserved in fossilized mud where there's a brontosaurus tracks and then there are human tracks following it. And that shouldn't be, right? Because supposedly there were millions of years between when brontosauruses lived and when human beings lived. But we can say we have knowledge that these creatures walk the earth from things like fossils and fossilized footprints, you know. So we're inferring something from what we see, you know, and so that's kind of an inferential belief. But nonetheless, it's based on indirectly on observations, right? Observations of the fossils and the footprints. I know when we were kids, our parents would take us up. Really, the subway left you right off to go up to New York to the, I think it was the Natural History Museum, and we used to love to see the fossils and stuff of dinosaurs. So empiricism is what we've grown up with. It's a very attractive theory of knowledge, you know, and it gives us a story of how we can have reliable, objective knowledge for everyday life in the sciences. All right, but we saw from the place where Descartes put us that if the mind is acquainted not directly with things in the outside world, but with its own inner experiences, then there becomes a real problem that the empiricists inherited from Descartes, a real problem of explaining how it is that we have knowledge of something in the outside world. Now, we didn't go into the part, and my PowerPoint doesn't dwell on the part of the meditations where Descartes tries to get back what he questioned. But remember, Descartes did not want to end up a skeptic. He was using this skeptical method to try to get at a firm basis for science. And you can say, and philosophy, and you say, well, how is he going to do that from one principle that says, I think, therefore I exist? How's he going to get back these other beliefs? Well, in really broad strokes, here's how he tries to do it. Descartes, remember, as a rationalist, thinks he's got some knowledge from birth. He's already got some ideas and some knowledge inside of him, just like Plato thought. Except for Plato and Socrates, we acquired this knowledge, like Meno's slave boy acquired this knowledge when our soul was in the realm of where the forms and the gods are prior to being incarnated in this body. Plato and Socrates both believed in reincarnation. Now, in a sort of Judeo-Christian framework, I mean, there's a biblical verse that says it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. There's not a lot of room for recycling through different bodies. Christian rationalists didn't believe that we acquired innate knowledge before birth, but that God somehow implanted this in our minds at birth. But we still have to work to bring it out. Now, the reason for bringing back innate ideas is the way Descartes tries to get us out of the problem that he has. In other words, when he has proved that he exists, the I think, therefore I am, then the only thing, strictly speaking, that he can justify philosophically is his own existence, not anything else. So how's he going to get the other stuff back? Because he wants to get it back, right? Descartes doesn't doubt any more than you and I doubt that he's in a real room, that there are real other people in the world, that God really exists, these other things. But how's he going to get it back philosophically? There's a view called solipsism, which is kind of where Descartes is after he proves that he exists. It's the view that we can know only the contents of our own minds. In other words, what the mind is acquainted with is its own inner experiences. And if that's the case, then how do we know we're not being deceived by the demon? How do we know we're not just dreaming it all up? Or we're in the Matrix, to bring it into this century. Well, the way Descartes tries to, in other words, if I'm a solipsist, the only person's existence I can justify philosophically is mind. So how do you get out of this? Because Descartes certainly doesn't want to be there. Well, he relies on his innate ideas. First, he looks at the I think, therefore I am, and he says, what makes I think, therefore I am necessarily true? In other words, what are the marks of necessary truth? Because right now, this is his only example of something that he knows absolutely for certain. So he looks at it, and he uses a visual metaphor. Richard Rorty, who was at Virginia when I was there, points this out very well. for the marks of truth. Descartes says it's clear and distinct. He uses clarity and distinctness. And what does he mean by this? Well, the easiest way of explaining it is to take something like what you see coming out of this projector, right? I mean, some of you have maybe fiddled with an old-fashioned slide projector before, trying to show vacation slides, or your parents had. Note, those letters, I mean, this projector is in focus, so the letters are clear, and they're also discernible from one another. They're also distinct from one another in that sentence, but empiricism has problems. But note, if we were going to fiddle with that thing and get it out of focus, you know what would happen, right? The letters would all of a sudden get fuzzy. They wouldn't be clear anymore, but you also couldn't identify them. They wouldn't be distinct from one another. They'd bleed into one another. And this is so Descartes is saying there's a kind of mark of truth here. That cuts out necessary ideas. So he says the cogito had this quality. Now, the way Descartes proceeds from there is he looks into his own mind to see if he has any other innate ideas that have the same mark of clarity and distinctness. And lo and behold, and here's how we get to something like the ontological argument, he finds that he has this clear and distinct idea of God. And we saw the properties of God that Descartes puts out in the ontological argument, a being who's all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect, etc. And so Descartes uses a proof for God's existence, the ontological argument, and he also uses one or two other a priori proofs. One is that he tries to prove the only cause that has enough reality in it to produce his perfect idea of God is God himself. That God himself is the only place of origin for his perfect idea, which is an indirect proof of God's existence. If God had to be around and there can't be any other cause of my idea of God, then that proves that God's there. Well, Descartes had to rely on a priori proofs. He couldn't use something like the design argument. At this stage of the game, he doesn't even know if anything besides his mind exists, right? He doesn't know that the world exists. He can't use a proof of God that depends on the existence of the world and qualities about the world, because right now he can't justify that. So he proves God's existence and that God has the perfect qualities that we saw in the ontological argument. And so a God like that is not going to deceive us when we come to something like, is that a real table? In other words, Descartes says God would in some sense be a deceiver if he made me such that I think that there's a real table here and there isn't. He's either allowed a malicious demon to deceive me, or it's all a dream, or something else. So, from the fact that he's proved the existence of God and that God is no deceiver, he gets back things like our perceptions of what we see around us, right? If God's there and God's no deceiver, and I think there's a real table here, then there must be a real table here. So he gets back what he questioned, and you say, well, if we're back where we started, what have we achieved? Well, what he thinks he's achieved, though, is now he's got certain principles that we've deduced that we can trust our senses when they tell us there's a table here. You know. But I mean, most of us, even if we have a strong faith in God, if somebody said, well, what are you more sure of? That God exists and that he's no deceiver, or that you know this table exists? I mean, most people would say, well, okay, I know the table exists. I have a strong faith in God, but that's based on faith, and maybe God's not there, but I'm convinced God is. In other words, most people would go the other way around, whereas Descartes' way of proceeding is to try to prove God's existence and that God is no deceiver, and so when my senses tell me there's a real table there, just go with it. They must be right. So now I've justified my belief.
If the person doesn't justify their belief, they'll go the other way.
Well, most of us would think that we're more sure that there's a table right here than we are that God exists, even if we have a strong faith in God. I think many people would admit that, whereas Descartes says no. First you prove God's existence and that he's no deceiver, and then if God is no deceiver, when you think there's a table there, there must be. Or else God would be a deceiver and making you so that you think there's a real table here, and there isn't, right? So at any rate, you can say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, first of all, Descartes' way of getting us out of this problem relies on innate ideas. Now we're going to see the empiricists reject innate ideas. But this is a technical point. Not going to ask you this on a test, but there's a problem in that Descartes' whole way of proceeding is what we call in logic a vicious circle, a circular argument that proves nothing. In other words, if you reason in a circle, you basically are assuming what you're supposed to be proving. And this has come to be called, over the years, the Cartesian circle. And I think I'm going to put it this, okay. How do I know I can trust my well, no. How do I know that what I clearly and distinctly perceive is necessarily true? In other words, we could ask Descartes this. And Descartes would reply, God exists and is no deceiver. So, what? Right. Well, that's the first time I've ever had somebody say that. God exists as a deceiver, so what I clearly and distinctly perceive is necessarily true. So, suppose he went on to ask, how do I know God exists and is no deceiver? And Descartes would say, I can prove God's existence from my necessarily true clear and distinct ideas. Anybody notice the problem with that? He needs a clear and distinct ideas to be necessarily true to prove God's existence, and he needs God to exist and be no deceiver in order to guarantee that the ideas are necessarily true. So the whole thing goes in a circle. And this was one reason why, and maybe the biggest reason, besides the fact that Descartes' solution depends on innate ideas, that the empiricists rejected Descartes' way out. And this is what you got to understand, and this is how we get these problems. Essentially, the empiricists, Descartes put the empiricists in the egocentric predicament in the position where the mind knows only its own inner experiences. They bought into that. We'll see what Locke says is the mind's acquainted with its own ideas. They bought into that, but then they rejected Descartes' way out. So they're left with the problems of skepticism, of being in that position. And that's why we have such big problems with perception and empiricism. Now, that you can kind of think about that and see why that's a circular argument. So what are some of the problems with perception? Well, as I said before, John Locke claims that when we come into this world, the mind is like that blackboard there. It's a tabula rasa. It's a blank slate. There are no innate ideas. Now, Locke didn't just say, well, that's my opinion, take it or leave it, but there are 4 books to Locke's essay concerning human understanding, the main book that we go back to for his views on knowledge. And he devotes most of the first book to attacking the rationalist notion of innate knowledge, innate ideas. So he cannot take Descartes' way out. Like I said, for Locke, the mind is a tabula rasa, blank slate, blank tablet at birth. And it's experience that writes knowledge onto the tablet after birth. A good computer analogy is if you go out to any store, you buy a computer, it's already got a lot of neat stuff on the hard drive, right? Well, that's kind of a picture of how the rationalists think we are when we come into the world. We've got a lot of innate knowledge in our minds already. And it's not knowledge of particular facts, but eternally true things like moral knowledge, knowledge of mathematical truths that they claimed was innate. But for the empiricists, I mean, if you took a computer, wiped all the information, reformatted the hard drive, so you have a blank hard drive, well, that's kind of a picture of how the empiricists think our mind is when we come into this world. It's blank, and any knowledge there comes after we're born. And it's experience, what we get from our five senses, or our five senses aided by instruments that writes on the tablet, or what we get from somebody else who's investigated something with their senses. So Locke gave alternative accounts of the origin of some of our ideas. I'm not going to pound this a lot, but our idea of perfection, infinity, our idea of God. In other words, one of the things the empiricists tried to do is give an alternative account of how we can have these ideas without their being innate. Because, I mean, one of the things that Socrates argued way back in the Phaedo, Plato's dialogue, is that if we can make an ordinary judgment, like two things are equal, but not perfectly equal. Say we had two lines, right? Say Socrates was drawing lines in the sand. And I said, you know what, these lines are equal, but they're not perfectly equal. Well, Socrates would say, well, how can you make a judgment like that unless you first know what perfect equality is? But no two lines are perfectly equal in this world, so you must have gained that knowledge before your soul came into this body in the world of what Plato called the forms, where there are perfect standards and there are perfect lines. So Socrates says if you have an idea of perfection, it has to be innate. Nothing's perfect in this world. Likewise, ideas like infinity or idea of God. Descartes thinks his idea of God is innate. Basically, the story we get, and this is a strange thing, and I leave it there. This graphic in the oldest version of PowerPoint that I was working with when I did this originally, the graphic was fine. In every succeeding version of PowerPoint, it inverts that graphic. And the answer to why that happens is buried somewhere deep in the code of this program, and I'm not even worried about it. But at any rate, basically their idea is we can start with something that's imperfect and mentally remove the imperfections. Like if I had limited imperfect knowledge of computers, you could say, well, what would you need to have perfect knowledge? If that's even possible. Really, that's not the greatest illustration. I mean, take an imperfect flower, right? You can say, well, okay, it's got a little brown spot here. This petal is misshapen. But suppose the petal, all the petals are now perfect, and there aren't any brown spots, and the color's perfect. You know, in other words, you remove mentally the imperfections, and you get an idea of what a perfect rose would be like, right? And so this is their story, that we can begin with an idea of the imperfect, and mentally we can construct an idea of the perfect. Or we can begin with something like limited space, and we can mentally extrapolate that idea out to form something like unlimited space or infinite space. Likewise, from finite attributes like existence duration in time, knowledge, power, wisdom. We can extrapolate those out to get necessary existence, eternal duration in time, from limited knowledge, all-knowing, omniscience, from limited power, omnipotence, from limited wisdom, infinite wisdom, and get the qualities of God without their having to be innate. So the empiricists tried to give us an alternative account of how we come by some concepts that we don't seem to be able to come by directly with our senses or from our senses in this world. Well, this is where we're going to go next. We only have a couple of minutes, but the whole key to understanding Locke is to understand what he means by idea. For Locke, an idea is a technical term, and an idea, or what qualifies as an idea for Locke, is, as he says, whatever the mind can be employed about in thinking, whatever is the object of the understanding when a person thinks. In other words, the things that our mind is immediately acquainted with, according to Locke, are its own ideas. And that puts Locke in the egocentric predicament. The mind is there. What it's first acquainted with is not something in the outside world, but its own inner ideas. Now, ideas for Locke, I like to say, include everything and the kitchen sink. They include abstract ideas like 2 + 2 = 4. But here's where you see that idea is being used in a very broad sense. If I smell a flower, my experience of that smell is for Locke an idea. If I see a bird or some birds, that visual experience is an idea. The ideas can also be internal. If I have a pain in my left knee, then the experience of that pain is an idea. Or if I feel the warmth from the sun or from a fireplace. Or a memory image, right? I call back a memory image, of my first high school sweetheart or something. Well, that's an idea. So you can see a lot, just about whatever we can have in our mind is for Locke an idea. But the problem for him, again, if the mind is acquainted only immediately with its own ideas, how do we get beyond those ideas to the claim that those ideas we immediately experience can represent things outside of us in a real world? Like, my idea of the table represents the table for Locke. So he thinks that we have like internal mental experiences that are like pictures of the table, and they convey knowledge to me because they represent the table, right? Anybody see the president firsthand in the flesh? Okay, none of us have, right? But every one of us thinks we know what the president looks like. How do we know what he looks like? Because we've seen images of the president in the media, in newspapers, on the internet, television. Well, and they convey knowledge to us, we think, of what the president really looks like. Well, for Locke, we have internal pictures of things, but he is confident that they convey knowledge to us of how things are in a real world outside of us. So we're going to look at how he thinks this next time. Thanks a lot. Somebody turn the roll or bring the roll up here. And I'm sorry, I don't have my Coppin briefcase with me, so I don't have any of your tests with me this morning. But okay, take care.